Welcome to Pacifica Institute Talk Series with Dr. Patrick Drinan about U.S. Electoral College and how it works. Uh, Dr. Drinan has a PhD from University of Virginia, and Dean Emeritus and Professor Emeritus of University of San Diego, former president of the Center for Academic Integrity, and former chief of staff for Congressman Mike Blouin, and chair of the Pacific Institute Advisory Council, and former president of the San Diego World Affairs Council, and hole-in-one at Oaks North Golf Course in San Diego in February. Maybe you can tell a little bit more about that to us, Dr. Drinan. And welcome to this talk series. It's great to have you here with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for the Pacifica Institute hosting this event. I play golf every Monday, and we have to have fun in life too, you know. Otherwise it can be a very difficult slog. So, but it's great being with you this evening. Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, with the topic, and it's kind of a timely topic, we have a few weeks until the election, and this Electoral College played an important role in the last elections. If you can tell us a bit more about this, and then we'll pass on to the Q&A. The floor is yours, Dr. Drinan.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I voted in the Electoral College. I was a member of the Electoral College 4 years ago. And so I speak from some practical experience and not just theoretical experience of being a professor. Which was a very nice ritual in Sacramento in mid-December 4 years ago. And even though it's fairly perfunctory in terms of the vote, the rituals surrounding it, you know, are very, very important. And ritual is important in many aspects of our life, whether it's religion or politics or the like. But what I'd like to do this evening here in late October of 2020 is to tell you a little bit about the context of the Electoral College, where it came from. I'd like to talk about, you know, political institution, how it mixes responsiveness and effectiveness and tries to combine them in its own way. Look at some current issues in terms of how this particular election may play out. And then look at some of the lessons that we are learning about Electoral College and how it plays out in American political life. First of all, context. The Electoral College it is not a democratic institution because in the United States, we are a republic and we have more democratic habits now and civil liberties than we did 400 years ago and 300 years ago. But the point is, our founding fathers really were not dipping into the experience of British political life in terms of what we currently understand it. When we think of England today and Britain, we think of Parliament, and Parliament being supreme. And we think of the centralization of power there and how people elect members of Parliament, and those elected members of Parliament elect a prime minister. Well, you know, this was not the world that our founding fathers came out of. They came here in the 16th and 17th centuries in a world in which Britain was very, very different, very decentralized, lots of competing institutions, judicial institutions and the like. And that's where our founding fathers, not mothers, because they couldn't vote back then, but founding fathers dipped into for their history. And so they really didn't value democracy as such. In fact, they were pretty anti-democratic. They thought democracy was kind of like mob rule. And they resented actually the English parliamentary system for being too centralized. And so they built in all these checks and balances in terms of what we wanted to do in our country. And one of those checks and balances is the Electoral College. We have of course, two sides of Capitol Hill in terms of the legislature, divided legislature. We have a Congress, and we have right now, and have for several decades, a very strong Supreme Court, which our founding fathers had very little interest in, actually. That just evolved over the last 200 years. So the presidency itself was not considered a powerful office. They knew George Washington would be our first president. And so and many people, in fact, wanted him to be like a king, but they didn't really want to go there. And George Washington himself was very restrained. So why the Electoral College? Well, first of all, they didn't want it. They wanted the election of the president to reflect states and the votes in each state for the president. We really don't have a national election in the United States. Many people think we have a national election coming up on November 3. We do not have a national election on November 3. We have 51 elections, 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And so we take those 51 states and 50 states in the District of Columbia, and we say whoever wins the majority in each of those states gets to vote in the Electoral College, and they're kind of obliged to vote that way. For example, in California, I voted for Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton won the state of California in 2016. 32 states will not permit. I could not have voted for Donald Trump, for example, in California. 32 of the 50 states require the elector to vote for whoever won the majority. Now, how did I become an elector? Just as well, I became an elector because I was working for a congressional candidate in Southern California, and he didn't win election, but because he was one of, every state gets electors that are a combination of the number of senators, which is 2 for each state, and then whatever number of congressional representatives there are. So he just appointed me. And so it was a single decision. And so I ended up going up to Sacramento in mid-December and the like. Now, why mid-December? First of all, it takes a long time for an election to really play out, and especially this year during a pandemic. We started voting weeks ago in the United States in various states, and we'll continue to be voting for another 2 to 3 weeks. And then there's the counting of the votes. And usually it takes at least a month for that to occur and to be certified. And so in the United States of America this year, the date of the election count is actually December 8th for purposes of the Electoral College. And so on December 8th, whoever has won the popular vote in, say, California or Mexico, wherever, they get to determine who wins, with an exception. The exception is that sometimes if it's too close to call, for example, in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, those states have a Democratic governor, but a Republican legislature. And it's very possible this year that if there are close votes in any of those 3 states, for example, Biden appeared to get the popular vote, but it was very, very close. The Republican legislature might even say to the Electoral College, you've got to vote for a Republican, and the Democratic governor could compete. If that occurred, then we'd have to wait until early January for the House of Representatives in early January to make a decision about who really won that state. So there's many complexities. I don't expect them to occur this year, though, because it seems like there's momentum developing in terms of a a state consensus through 50 states and the District of Columbia. Now, Trump could still win the general election because the Republicans have an advantage in terms of small states which have a state like Wyoming has 3 electoral college votes, and that gives each individual voter in Wyoming far greater power than a California voter, because we have dozens of congressional seats, and just 2 senators, just like Wyoming. So there are more states in the United States that are GOP controlled and are smaller states, and that's why it's going to be very hard to ever amend the Constitution to eliminate the Electoral College. Lots of people say, well, why don't we just have a popular vote? Well, it would take a constitutional amendment to eliminate the Electoral College, with one perhaps exception, just like the founding fathers said that voters would not vote US senators in. It took until the late 19th century to eliminate the role of state legislatures, which at that time elected the US senators in each state, for a constitutional amendment to occur that permitted the popular vote, that is males back then, to vote for a president in each state and to be recognized as such. There is a movement throughout much of the country, in many states, in which the state could, in what we call a compact of the states, agree that the winner of the popular vote in the United States would automatically get the vote of the state. For example, if Biden won the popular vote, which he will, and a state like South Dakota, if it were in the compact, would agree that even if Trump won South Dakota, they would defer in terms of the electors in the Electoral College to the popular vote nationally. Now, the chances of that occurring soon are quite modest, and so it might be 8 to 10 years away. But that doesn't necessarily bother the American governing system. The American governing system is based upon several centuries ago English political practices, and they did not necessarily at that time value effectiveness over responsiveness. They wanted divided government back then, and that's what we have. And we don't have efficient government in the sense of effective government in the United States. Our founding fathers wanted ineffective government. They wanted very limited government. And so they divided governmental functions, and they made it very hard for the popular vote to be transmitted into a conclusion that would be definitive. And so the Electoral College is just part of that whole characterization of what the American Constitution set up. Now, this may be very confusing to people from Turkey or anywhere else in the world, but it's also very confusing to Americans. And very few Americans understand the Electoral College. Many of them want to change it, of course. Excuse me, but change comes very slowly in the United States of America. Our Constitution is one of the oldest, and so it's not a modern Constitution. In fact, I'd like to conclude my remarks before having Q&A by simply saying, do not assume the United States has a modern form of government, because we do not. We have a late medieval form of government, excuse me, We have a late medieval form of government, and that's worked fairly well for us until the present times. It's been amended, of course, in terms of our Constitution and practices. But the American people value it, and they look forward to it working itself out, even though many parts of it are fairly arbitrary and confusing. That's the way the founding fathers wanted it. Thank you. Oh, I'm not hearing you.
Thank you, Dr. Drinan. Thanks for the reminder. I forgot to unmute my microphone. But you also surprised me by saying that the U.S. Government is a very inefficient, actually, government because of its checks and balances.
Yes.
I think that's what the founding fathers had in mind in the first place. And that's how these checks and balances are kind of protecting the system in America so that it doesn't shift one place arbitrarily very quickly, I suppose. And one question, while you were talking about that, one of our viewers asked that question actually, and he's saying, I'm very much surprised to see how the US struggles to execute smooth elections. I simply do not understand it. And at that time, you were talking about how inefficient the form of government is, and actually maybe the election is. And is the US incapable of doing so? You a little bit mentioned that, or is not willing to. What is the problem? How do you see that?
So the question is, can we become more effective and efficient? Really?
And in terms of elections, because it says U.S. struggles to execute smooth elections with the mail-in ballots and other stuff that's going on. As you said, I simply do not understand the obstacles. Is U.S. incapable of executing smooth elections?
We're very capable of having smooth elections. We have 50 states and hundreds of counties that do it. The national government doesn't do elections. It's the state governments and county governments that do that. And they're very capable of doing it, and they do it very efficiently. There were times of great corruption back 120 years ago in terms of elections and the like. And there's some interesting stories about how elections occurred back in the middle of the 20th century. When Jimmy Carter, for example, was running for his first office in Georgia, he, on election night, he asked his campaign manager how things were going. His campaign manager said, well, we don't know until the dead vote comes in. And the dead vote, or in Georgia back then, dead people could vote for up to 5 years after they're passed away, because people assume that their relatives would know how they would vote. And so that's a kind of an inefficiency of this. But that got corrected. Excuse me. That got corrected, of course. But America does elections all the time, and there's very few abuses in it. Very, minuscule in terms of abuses in terms of running the elections themselves. Mail ballots have been used for years and years and years by states with no difficulty whatsoever. And so there really is no difficulty. Americans are used to voting. In fact, the average American votes far more than the average citizen of England or even Turkey. You see how long our ballots are in the United States. I mean, we have dozens and dozens of races to vote for, and local governments are filling all sorts of seats. And most Americans can't even figure it out. I have a PhD in government myself, and I have a difficult time looking at our own ballot. But the point is that the complexity of our ballot system and the many offices that we have, in a sense, increase the reliability of elections in the United States because of the standardization that has to occur in the cooperation of all levels of government, state and local governments, in order for elections to occur.
All right, I see. Well, thank you. And another question comes, actually, you answered this question, but do you think Electoral College is democratic? That was
Definitely
one
not.
question.
It's definitely not democratic. It's not one person, one vote at all. It's designed to be anti-democratic, as was the Senate of the United States and the like. And we're developing more democratic instincts with time, very slowly. In terms of electing senators directly back in the late 19th century, giving women the right to vote, giving blacks the right to vote back in the 1860s and 70s, where we took that away, of course, until recently, and we're still trying to take that away now. But the notion of voter suppression, for example, that we hear a lot about, is an issue that's very much a U.S. issue. You hardly hear about voter suppression at all amongst right-wing groups in Europe, for example. They don't try to do that, but we have it in the United States as a legacy of the slavery system and Jim Crow, which took away rights to vote, mostly of blacks, but also of poor whites in the South back in the 1870s and 1880s. In fact, one of the reasons we have the Electoral College in the United States is because of slavery. The 3/5 rule back of the original Constitution was put in for a variety of reasons, one of which was to make the Electoral College more pro-Southern, because you counted 3/5 of the slaves as human beings for purposes of the census. And what that meant was that the southern states, the slave states, had far more congressional seats than they would have if they said the slaves had no status whatsoever. And so the Electoral College had from the very beginning a southern bias to it. And when we eliminated slavery, although we didn't eliminate the Jim Crow system and the like, and in fact, we're still fighting on that Jim Crow system even today. But there's a slow arc of progress in terms of increasing the democratization of America. But it will be very, very slow, because we don't just have revolutions and bring in new constitutions. Some countries will get a new constitution, every 50, 75 years. And the United States has the same one, and it's very slow to change and adapt.
Thank you. Another question comes, you mentioned that average North Dakotans voter with only 3 or 2 electoral votes is worth more than an average California voter with 55 electoral votes. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, it's just that the individual voter has the less weight to their vote in California. For example, in Wyoming, with say 500,000 people, they end up with 3 electoral votes, whereas in California we have several dozen, and so it's watered down. Our votes are watered down here compared to Wyoming. Now, we do have a lot more Electoral College votes than Wyoming does, and some people used to say that the more heavily populated states had an advantage in the Electoral College, and there's some truth to that also, because Florida and Pennsylvania, New York, California, Texas, you win those states, and you don't have to work very hard for them. So most of the problems in the United States in terms of trying to do a national election, we don't have a national election, has to do with the contest in the swing states of the upper Midwest, where you try to get some of those states with maybe a dozen Electoral College votes to switch. Hardly any investment in California. Everybody knows how California is going to vote in this election. So, there's no need to campaign here. So a lot of the bias is toward the smaller states in terms of actual campaigning.
I see. Thank you. And another question comes, it's what's your personal thought if the framers of the Constitution were alive nowadays? would they include Electoral College in writing the Constitution?
That's a very, very good question. Um, uh, they might, but they still have the Electoral College. I think they still might do it in order to keep the small states satisfied with the system. But I think they would not have been surprised by the growth of the voting population and would be happy with that. That is, they would have been happy with the number of men who were permitted to vote. That is, more property. It was only property owners and the like at first who were permitted to vote in most of the states back at the Founding Fathers' time. So they expanded the male vote over a period of 40 or 50 years. And then, of course, they permitted slaves to vote after the 1860s. And finally, we had women getting to vote as more property. And it was only property last century. And so I think they knew that the pressure for equality, because equality was always there as in the thinking in the Founding Fathers, because they liked equality in relationship to their British overlords before we gained independence. And so that spirit of equality, I think they would have looked for. But whether they would have supported the Electoral College, they may have or may not have. I don't think it would have been a big issue for them now. But I think they would have appreciated the arc of progress that occurred on general equality in the United States.
Well, you talk about the arc of progress. That question comes, do you think that the arc of progress would shift towards the from the Electoral College to a democratic national election? What's your take on that?
Well, it would take a constitutional amendment for that to occur. And again, we don't have a national election. We have 51 elections on November 3. And so, yeah, we're very, very slow to build a national identity. Even in the pandemic, you hear the president and others talking about, well, the states need to do that. You know, we're not really a nation. And so it's a very complicated, structure we've set up in the United States. And until it's found to be completely wanting in terms of some revolutionary act or a new constitutional convention, I think most people think that if we were going to make dramatic change, it would not be even by the amendment process. We have a process that could set up a national new constitutional convention at some point. And that may occur in the next 50 years. And that may not sound very quick, but politics in America does not usually work very quickly unless you're watching the velocity of the evening news tonight.
And with that, we have approached our program's end. Thank you, Dr. Drinan. Our last questionnaire is a good friend of yours. He says, we know that Patrick loves jokes. Can he share a joke with us in the spirit of today, and where things are too many, sometimes too overwhelming for most of us? Can you share a joke with us? Our good friend is asking.
Okay. Well, yeah, I do like jokes, and Mesut has always loved our laughter together. Well, I'll give. How about two jokes? One that's quite frivolous, and then one that's a little bit more serious and attuned to the day. Let me tell. I'm Irish American background, but I have a story about Dublin. A woman named Mary goes to the parish priest in the morning for mass and says to the priest, "Father, I have some very sad news. My husband died last night. He drowned in he works at the Guinness factory, and he drowned in a vat of beer." And the priest says, "Oh, I hope it was a quick death." And Mary said, no, it was not quick. He got out 3 times to pee. Very silly. How about a political joke? What's the difference between Donald Trump and God? And the answer to that one is God knows he's not Donald Trump. Think about that one.
Well, Dr. Drinan, thank you for being with us today. There are more questions that are coming up, but in the spirit of keeping our time and in respect of our audience, thank you for being with us tonight, Dr. Drinan. It's wonderful to have you at such a timely topic, and we're looking forward to having you in a future event, hopefully in 2021, in person, hopefully. These Zoom meetings and also YouTube live events are good, but being in person is also important, I suppose, and significant. And we hope we have some beautiful days and years ahead of us beyond this pandemic, and also beyond all these protests and other things that happened in 2020. We are wishing for a wonderful 2021 and beyond, hopefully for all of us. Dr. Drinan, thank you for this.
You're very, very welcome.
Thank you.